The rain had started some time after midnight, an unrelenting drizzle that painted the Paris streets in streaks of silver and shadow. By the time Inspector Jules Marchand arrived at the Hotel Lafayette, the cobblestones outside gleamed like polished glass under the flickering street lamps. The hotel itself was an elegant relic of another era, ornate, wrought-iron balconies, a grand arched entrance, and a doorman who looked as if he had been standing there since Napoleon's time. A young officer met Marchand at the entrance, his uniform damp, his expression taut with unease. "It's room 403, Inspector." "A strange one," he murmured as they climbed the narrow carpeted stairs. Marchand had seen his share of crime scenes, but the moment he stepped into room 403, a peculiar stillness settled over him. A man lay sprawled on the plush red carpet, face down, motionless. The body belonged to an Englishman named Howard Penrose, a businessman of some repute, but not someone who should have ended his life like this, stripped to his underclothes, his suitcase missing, his hotel key left inside the locked room. The immediate detail that gnawed at Marchand was the sheer impossibility of it. The door had been locked from the inside, the windows latched. No sign of forced entry. It was the kind of crime that made no sense, and yet here it was, a puzzle that defied logic. "Nothing stolen," said Sergeant Gautier, shifting uneasily beside the bed. "His watch is still on the nightstand, wallet untouched. But the suitcase—" Marchand stepped around the body carefully. "The suitcase? Gone. The maid swears it was here at noon. By the time she came back in the evening, it had vanished. No one saw him leave the room with it. No one saw anyone enter." Marchand knelt beside the corpse. A quick examination revealed no gunshot wounds, no obvious signs of violence, and yet something was off. The dead man's fingers were clenched tightly, his nails biting into his palm. Marchand pried them open carefully and found a single strand of black thread. "A tailor's thread," he murmured. Gautier frowned. "Odd thing to be holding on to while dying." Marchand said nothing. He turned his attention to the rest of the room. The furnishings were undisturbed. The bed was still made, suggesting Penrose had never gotten into it. On the desk, a half-smoked cigarette lay in an ashtray, lipstick smeared at the tip. Not his, then. A visitor. He moved toward the wardrobe. A single suit remained hanging inside, grey wool, the type a businessman might wear. But something nagged at him. He ran his fingers along the empty space where the missing suitcase should have been. There were faint scuff marks on the wooden shelf. Something had been dragged across it recently. He turned back to Gautier. "The hotel staff. Who cleaned this room last?" "Did the maid, Lucille Moreau." "She's downstairs?" Marchand nodded and stood. The suitcase was the key. Its absence was too deliberate, too pointed. He just needed to understand why. As he left the room, the cigarette's lipstick stain lingered in his mind. Someone had been here before Penrose died. Someone who had left no trace except for a missing suitcase and a thread of black cloth. The case had only just begun, and already it felt like a trap designed to mislead. Marchand found Lucille Moreau in the staff quarters behind the hotel kitchen, sitting stiffly in a wooden chair, her hands gripping the edge of her apron. She was a young woman, perhaps 25, with sharp cheekbones and dark curls tucked beneath her cap. Her eyes darted toward him as he entered, wary but not frightened. She had the look of someone who had already told her story once and wasn't eager to repeat it. "I understand you were the last to see the suitcase," Marchand said, his voice even. She nodded. "Yes, sir. I cleaned the room at noon. It was there, sitting on the luggage stand, same as it was when he checked in 2 nights ago." "And you noticed it missing when?" around 7 in the evening. I went in to turn down the bed, but Mr. Penrose wasn't there. The suitcase was gone, but the rest of his things were untouched. I assumed he had taken it somewhere. Marchand studied her face. Did anything seem out of place? She hesitated just for a second. Well, she said, lowering her voice, there was a smell, like a strong perfume. The kind ladies wear when they want to be noticed. Marchand leaned in slightly. Did you see anyone suspicious in the corridor? She shook her head. No, sir, but... Her lips pressed together, as if debating whether to continue. Madame Lauron, one of our guests, came down the stairs around that time. She's in room 407, a regular guest stays often. But last night, she seemed different. How so? Lucille hesitated again. She usually walks with her head high like a queen, but last night she kept looking over her shoulder, and she was carrying something, a black coat draped over her arm, but she was holding it close like she didn't want anyone to see what was underneath. Marchand absorbed this. And the perfume. Could it have been hers? It might have been. I've smelled it before in the halls after she passes. He nodded and rose. Thank you, Mademoiselle Moreau. You've been helpful. As he stepped out into the corridor, Gautier met him with an impatient huff. We checked with the hotel staff. No one saw the suitcase leave the premises. Either it vanished into thin air, or Penrose carried it out himself before returning. Marchand tapped a finger against his chin. Unlikely he was found in his underclothes. If he left with the suitcase, where did his clothes go? Gautier exhaled sharply. So someone took the suitcase after he returned. Marchand nodded, his mind already turning. The missing suitcase, the locked room, the scent of perfume, and a woman carrying something she didn't want seen. The pieces were there, but the picture remained incomplete. He made his way up to the 4th floor, the corridor silent except for the faint ticking of a hallway clock. Room 407, Madame Lauron. He rapped his knuckles against the door. A moment later, it opened just a crack. A woman peered out, perhaps in her late 30s, with auburn hair piled elegantly atop her head, lips painted the same deep shade as the lipstick on Penrose's cigarette. Her eyes flicked over him, assessing. Yes, Inspector?
Jules Marchand, may I have a moment? She hesitated, then stepped back, allowing him inside.
The suite was lavish but dimly lit, a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. A glass of red wine sat half-finished on the vanity. Marchand took in the surroundings with a practiced glance. Did you know Howard Penrose? Her expression remained poised, but a flicker of something, annoyance, caution, crossed her face. We had met. In what context? She walked slowly to the vanity, lifting the wine glass with delicate fingers. He was charming. Too charming, I think. The type of man who collects acquaintances like one collects fine cigars. But I wouldn't say we were close. Marchand's gaze drifted toward the armchair near the window. A black coat was draped over it. He stepped closer, reaching out as if to straighten it, and felt a slight weight in the pocket. A subtle movement of his fingers confirmed what he already suspected. Fabric, something smooth, folded. He withdrew his hand before she could notice. You were seen coming downstairs last night, around 7, he said, watching her reaction. She took a slow sip of wine. I often come and go in the evenings. With a coat over your arm? Her fingers tensed around the glass for the briefest moment. It was chilly. Was it? Marchand murmured. Or were you carrying something
else?
Her gaze locked onto his, and for the first time Her confidence wavered. Not much, but enough. Marchand smiled faintly. "I'll be in touch, Madame Lauron." As he stepped back into the hallway, he let out a slow breath. The deception had begun. He had seen the edge of it, like a silk thread unraveling from a garment. Now he only needed to pull. Marchand left Madame Lauron's suite with the faint trace of her perfume still clinging to the air around him. He walked down the dimly lit corridor, hands in his pockets, his mind sifting through the inconsistencies. The woman had been careful with her words, yet her grip on the wine glass had tightened at the wrong moments. She had spoken smoothly, but too smoothly, like someone rehearsing rather than recalling. And then there was the coat, the weight in its pocket. It had been an instinct not to pull it out in front of her, but now he regretted leaving it behind. He would have to tread carefully. Gautier was waiting at the end of the hall, arms crossed. "The hotel manager's downstairs. He wants to speak with you." Marchand nodded and followed him down the wide staircase to the lobby, where Henri Dubois, the manager of the Hotel Lafayette, stood near the reception desk. Dubois was a tall, thin man with an impeccable moustache and the demeanour of someone who had seen too much but preferred not to get involved. As Marchand approached, the manager gave a tight, weary smile. "I trust you are making progress, Inspector?" His voice was polite, but his eyes flickered with unease. "That depends," Marchand said. "Tell me about Mr. Penrose. Did he have—"
"Visitors?" Dubois hesitated. "He was discreet, but yes, I believe so. He dined alone most nights, but once or twice I saw him speaking with guests in the lounge. Madame Lauron, for instance." Marchand arched a brow. "And others?"
Dubois shifted on his feet. "There was a man. I didn't catch his name. They spoke in hushed tones near the fireplace 3 nights ago. I assumed it was business." Marchand pressed further. "Describe him." "Short, stocky, dark hair, combed back, well-dressed, but in a way that seemed deliberate." Dubois paused. "Like a man trying to blend in rather than belonging." "A disguise, then, or someone cautious." "Did Penrose seem troubled after speaking with him?" "I wouldn't say troubled," Dubois said carefully, "but thoughtful, perhaps." Concerned, Marchand studied the manager's face. There was more, but Dubois was holding back. He decided to let the silence stretch. Sure enough, the man sighed. "I didn't want to get involved, but I overheard something. When the gentleman left, Penrose muttered
under his breath something about the Black Suitcase, and he didn't sound pleased."
Marchand straightened slightly. So Penrose had spoken of the suitcase before it disappeared. And this was 3 nights ago? Yes. Dubois hesitated, then added, "And last night he received a telegram. I delivered it to his room myself." Marchand's pulse quickened. "Where is it now?" "I assumed the police took it, but I checked his belongings earlier. It's missing." A missing telegram. Another absence. Things were being removed from the crime scene, but by whom? Gautier exhaled sharply. "Someone's being thorough," Marchand nodded. "Or someone is panicking." He turned back to Dubois. "Who else had access to Penrose's room?" "The usual staff, the maid, the bellhop, and, of course, his visitors." "Did Madame Lauron visit him?" Dubois hesitated again. "I saw her coming down from the 4th floor the night before his death." "That's not what I asked." The manager's jaw tightened. "I can't say for certain. But she lingers where she pleases." Marchand glanced at Gautier. "Let's speak with the bellhop." They found the young man near the entrance, nervously twisting the brim of his cap. He was barely 20, with the eager yet wary look of someone who knew more than he should. I already told the officers everything," he stammered. "Tell me again," Marchand said calmly. "What do you remember about Mr. Penrose's?"
"Last day?" The boy licked his lips. "He was in and out of his room, pacing a lot, seemed anxious. He asked me for matches in the afternoon, said he was expecting someone." "Did they arrive?" The bellhop hesitated. I think so. A woman."
"Madame Lauron?" He shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Someone else. Younger. Dark hair, foreign accent. English, maybe. She only stayed a few minutes." Marchand exchanged a glance with Gautier. "Another visitor, one the others hadn't
mentioned." "What time was this?" "Around 6:30. I saw her leave. She was carrying something small, wrapped in a scarf." "Something small? A telegram? A letter? Or something from the missing suitcase?" Marchand's mind raced. "And Penrose, how?"
Did he seem after? The bellhop swallowed. "Worried." He kept checking his watch. Then he told me to bring him a whiskey at 7. 7. The same time, Lucille Moreau had noticed the suitcase was missing. The same time Madame Lauron had been seen descending. The stairs, clutching her coat, everything was converging. Marchand tapped his fingers against his cane. "If this woman returns, you tell me at once." The boy nodded quickly, grateful to be dismissed. Gautier let out a breath. A telegram, a missing woman, a suitcase that vanishes, feels like too many pieces. Not if they're all part
"Of the same game," Marchand murmured. "Penrose knew something. He was waiting for someone, but he wasn't sure who to trust. And now every trace of his last hours is being erased." Gautier frowned. "What are you thinking?"
Marchand looked toward the grand staircase, toward the upper floors where secrets still lingered. "I'm thinking," he said quietly, "that we're not the only ones searching for answers." Marchand stood in the dimly lit hotel lobby, the weight of the case pressing against him like the heavy Parisian rain outside. The pieces were scattered, none fitting together just yet. Penrose had been afraid, that much was clear. But of whom? The stocky man he had met in the lounge, the mysterious Englishwoman, Madame Lauron. And then there was the missing suitcase. Its absence felt deliberate, as though someone had wanted to erase its significance entirely. The problem was, without knowing what was inside, Marchand could only guess at its importance. He turned to Gautier. "We need to confirm Madame Lauron's
movements last night. If she wasn't in her room the whole time, she had opportunity."
Gautier nodded. "Dubois said she lingers. I'd say she lurks." Marchand gave a faint smile, but remained focused. "And the Englishwoman? Someone knew she was with Penrose, because they made sure she disappeared from the story. No name, no trace. Find out if any English guests checked in recently or if someone left unexpectedly this morning." Gautier left to make inquiries, and Marchand made his way back up the grand staircase. The hallway on the 4th floor was silent, except for the steady ticking of a wall clock. He paused outside Madame Lauron's door, considering. She was hiding something, that much was obvious. But was she hiding her own crime or someone else's? He had no proof of her guilt, only a tangle of contradictions. Instead, he walked past her suite and knocked on room 405. A moment later, the door opened to reveal an older man with a tired face and thick spectacles. Henri Leclerc, a retired journalist who had been staying at the hotel for over a month. If anyone had been watching the comings and goings of the 4th floor, it was him. Leclerc squinted at him. "Inspector, what can I do for you?" Marchand stepped inside and took
a seat by the window.
You've been here long enough to know when something isn't right. Tell me what you saw last night, Leclerc sighed, running a hand over his thinning hair. I heard movement in the corridor. Not unusual. This is a hotel, after all. But there was something odd. A door opening, closing softly, like someone didn't want to be heard.
I didn't look, but I had the feeling someone was standing outside for a moment, hesitating. Marchand leaned forward. Which room? Leclerc tapped his fingers against his chair. Between 403 and 407, Marchand nodded. And did you hear voices? Leclerc hesitated. Not clearly, but I did hear footsteps going down the stairs, unhurried but careful.
That aligned with Lucille Moreau's sighting of Madame Lauron descending around 7. But why would she stand outside Penrose's door first, waiting for someone, or deciding whether to enter? Marchand thanked him and left. He turned toward 407, but before he could knock, the door opened. Madame Lauron stood before him, a thin smile on her lips as if she had expected him. "You returned so soon, Inspector," she said, her voice like silk, stretched tight. "I find myself drawn back," he replied. "Do you mind if I step inside?" She gestured with an elegant hand. "By all means." Marchand entered, eyes scanning the room once more. The black coat was still draped over the chair, its pocket concealing
something.
He turned to her. "Let's be honest, madame. You were near Penrose's room last night." Leclerc heard someone outside. She didn't flinch. Instead, she walked to her vanity, adjusting an earring in the mirror. "Perhaps I was returning to my room. I may have paused because," she met his gaze in the mirror, "because I was curious, Inspector." Marchand tilted his head slightly. "Curious about what?" A beat of silence, then she turned, folding her arms. "Mr. Penrose was a man of secrets. I had a cordial acquaintance with him, but I suspected he was involved in something beyond business. Last night I wanted to
ask him directly, but when I reached his door, I lost my nerve. Did you see anyone else? A hesitation. Small, but there. No, she said, finally. Marchand stepped toward the chair, fingers brushing the edge of the black coat. And this? She
sighed, as if exhausted by the game. "Go on, Inspector. Look." He reached into the pocket and pulled out a neatly folded black cloth. It was part of a suit, a sleeve, cut cleanly at the shoulder. The missing suitcase had contained clothing, not just any clothing, this clothing. Someone had taken the suit, cut it apart, and discarded what they didn't need. Marchand turned the sleeve over in his hands. "Why keep this?" Madame Lauron's expression darkened. "Because I found it in the corridor early this morning. Someone dropped it outside my door." A new player had entered the game. Someone moving in the shadows, erasing, discarding, leaving only fragments behind. Marchand exhaled slowly. "You were right, madame. Penrose was involved in something beyond business." She smiled faintly. "Then the question is, Inspector, how far beyond?" The pieces were beginning to align. The suitcase hadn't been stolen for valuables. It
had been removed to erase an identity. But whose and why? He had a feeling the answers lay with the missing Englishwoman.
And the stocky man Penrose had met 3 nights ago. It was time to uncover who had really been staying at the Hotel Lafayette. The black fabric in Marchand's hands felt heavier than it should have. A severed sleeve, cut from the missing suit, discarded, yet left just close enough to be found. Someone was playing a careful game. Madame Lauron watched him with her feline calm, but beneath it there was something else, something wary. He couldn't decide if she was afraid or simply enjoying the spectacle. "Who else knows you found this?" he asked. "No one," she said smoothly. Until now. Marchand tucked the sleeve into his coat. If this had been left outside her door, someone wanted to implicate her, or at least lead him down a particular path. A misdirection. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Gautier entered, breathless. "We've found something," he said. Marchand followed him into the corridor, the younger officer speaking in hushed, urgent tones. A guest, Monsieur Bisset, reported seeing someone dispose of something in the alley behind the hotel this morning. We checked. He handed Marchand a small leather-bound notebook. It was damp from the lingering drizzle outside, its edges curling. Marchand opened it carefully. Inside, written in a precise hand, were pages of notes. The name Penrose appeared multiple times, underlined. Alongside it, the words arrangement confirmed, and London, final notice. A list of dates followed. Marchand's fingers tightened around the notebook. This wasn't just casual business. This was a record of something impending, something Penrose had been tangled in before his death. He turned a page. A name stood alone at the bottom of one entry. Andrews. He looked at Gautier. "Who is Andrews?" We checked the hotel registry. No guest by that name, but... He hesitated. "A witness claims the man Penrose met in the lounge 3 nights.
Ago had an English accent. Marchand felt a flicker of something, an instinct sharpening into shape. "Where is this witness?" "Dubois. He says he saw the man leave last night, a few hours after Penrose was killed." Marchand exhaled. It
was too clean, too simple. And yet, within the hour, the authorities had their suspect. A rush of activity overtook the investigation as the police announced they had identified Andrews, or rather, a man travelling under the name Richard Wells, a known forger, linked to financial crimes across Europe. He had left Paris early that morning, his name now flagged, at every border. The case, it seemed, had cracked open neatly. Penrose had been involved in something illicit. A deal had gone wrong, and the man he had met in secret had silenced him. A crime of betrayal. Marchand stood at the edge of the commotion, watching. It was a perfect resolution. Too perfect, because something didn't fit. The suitcase, the missing telegram, the woman who had visited Penrose before his death. And then there was the discarded sleeve. If Andrews had killed Penrose, why would he waste time trying to erase his identity afterward? Why not flee the moment the job was done? Madame Lauron had said something earlier. Then the question is, Inspector, how far beyond fraud and betrayal did this crime really stretch? He turned and walked away from the gathered officers, ignoring the murmurs of satisfaction behind him, because deep in his gut, Marchand knew this case wasn't solved. It had just begun. Marchand left the police station and stepped onto the wet Parisian streets, the faint hum of gas lamps flickering against the misty evening air. The city moved, as it always did, indifferent, to the supposed resolution of the case, but the knot in his stomach remained. The pieces had fallen into place too neatly, as if someone had arranged them to be found. His fingers tightened around the small leather notebook recovered from the alley. Andrews, or Richard Wells, had been named as Penrose's killer, but there was something in these pages that no one had questioned yet. Marchand hailed a cab and gave the driver an address, not to the hotel, not to the station, but to a place he had not visited in years, an old bookstore on Rue Saint-Dominique. The shop was nearly empty when he arrived, the air thick with dust and the scent of old paper. Behind the counter sat a man in his 60s, spectacles perched low on his nose. You still keep the archives? Marchand asked. The man looked up and studied him for a moment before nodding. In the back, Marchand stepped past shelves filled with yellowed newspapers and bound volumes of forgotten scandals. He knew what he was looking for, even if he didn't have the name for it yet. The notebook had contained more than just Penrose's name and notes on financial dealings. There were dates that seemed too deliberate to be ignored. He found the section he needed, pulling out a worn ledger of old crime reports from nearly 2 decades ago. Flipping through the pages, he searched for something, anything that might explain why Penrose had been marked for death. And then he found it. A name buried in an article from 15 years prior. Jonathan Andrews, not Richard Wells, not a forger, but a real man, long presumed dead. The article described a scandal that had erupted in London, a financial fraud case that had ruined lives. A man named Jonathan Andrews had been implicated, but had vanished before he could be arrested. The case had gone cold. The money had never been recovered. Marchand leaned back against the shelf, exhaling slowly. The past was creeping into the present. Penrose had known. That was why he was killed. And now Marchand needed to find out who else had known the truth before another body turned up in an alley. Marchand sat in a quiet cafe, the old crime report open in front of him, its yellowed pages blending into the dim glow of the street lamps outside. Jonathan Andrews, once a rising name in London's financial world, had vanished 15 years ago, leaving behind only scandal and ruin. His crimes had been buried under layers of speculation, his name fading into history. Yet here it was again, written in Penrose's notebook, scrawled in a deliberate hand. If Andrews was dead, why had Penrose been tracking him? The thought nagged at Marchand as he sipped his coffee. His instincts told him that the answer wasn't in documents or records. It was in the people surrounding Penrose's final hours. Someone knew more than they were letting on. He needed a way to shake them loose. By morning, Marchand was back at the Hotel Lafayette, his plan forming. He stopped at the front desk, speaking in a hushed voice to the receptionist, a small request, just enough to stir the waters. Then he waited. It didn't take long. An hour later, he sat in the hotel lounge, reading a newspaper, when a figure approached his table, Madame Lauron. She moved with her usual grace, but there was a tension in her shoulders, something just barely restrained. "Inspector," she said smoothly, "I hear you have an update on the case." Marchand folded the newspaper and gestured for her to sit. "Word travels fast," she smiled faintly. "You asked the staff about Jonathan Andrews." Marchand leaned back. "And that name means something to you." She held his gaze for a moment too long before reaching for her cigarette case. "Should it?" Marchand allowed a pause to settle between them. Silence was often more revealing than words. He watched as she lit her cigarette, the flame steady. "You hesitated," he said finally. She exhaled a stream of smoke. "Did I?" Marchand smiled. People often do when they're deciding how much truth to reveal. For the first time since he had met her, she looked away. A flicker of something, not quite fear, but calculation. "It's an old name, isn't it?" she murmured. Marchand studied her. "You knew Penrose was looking into him?" She tapped ash into the tray.
I suspected. He leaned forward. "And you know why he was killed?" A beat of silence. Then she whispered, "Not entirely." Marchand let her words settle before he spoke again. Penrose thought Andrews was alive. Her fingers tightened around the cigarette holder.
There. A small crack. Marchand pressed on. If Andrews didn't die 15 years ago, then someone helped him disappear. Someone with influence. Perhaps someone who feared he would return. She held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "You're looking in the wrong places, Inspector." He felt the shift then, a quiet realization settling in. The crime wasn't just about Penrose, it was about keeping a ghost buried, and someone in this hotel had spent 15 years making sure Jonathan Andrews stayed dead, on paper if not in reality. Marchand left the hotel with his mind racing. Madame Lauron had given him little, but her reaction had been enough. She knew more than she was letting on. And if she knew, then someone else did too. Someone who was willing to kill to keep it hidden. Jonathan Andrews was supposed to be dead. But Penrose had been looking for him, and now Penrose was dead instead. That wasn't a coincidence. The notebook. He reached into his coat, fingers closing around the small, leather-bound book. It was the one piece of solid evidence he had, a direct link between Penrose and whatever truth had been buried 15 years ago. He needed to go through it again, more carefully this time. There had to be something he'd overlooked. He took a cab to his office, the ride passing in a blur of wet streets and dimly lit alleyways. He was already forming a plan. He would cross-check the names in the notebook, see if any of them had surfaced over the years. Someone had helped Andrews disappear. Maybe someone had helped bring him back. But when he stepped inside his office, he stopped cold. The desk drawer was open. Papers were scattered across the floor. His filing cabinet had been forced open, its contents rifled through, and the notebook was gone. For a long moment, Marchand just stood there, the weight of what had happened sinking in. Someone had been here. Someone who knew exactly what to look for. His first instinct was to search, but he already knew it was useless. The thief had been precise. Nothing else had been taken, nothing else disturbed. Just the one thing that could tie Penrose to Andrews. Someone was watching him. He turned sharply to the window, stepping forward, scanning the street below. The usual figures moved through the rain. Couples, a man selling newspapers, a lone woman hurrying beneath an umbrella.
None of them seemed out of place, but someone had been here, and whoever it was, they weren't finished. He exhaled slowly. The notebook was gone, but that didn't mean the trail was cold. Whoever had stolen it had just made a mistake. They
had shown their hand. They were afraid, and fear always left a trace. Marchand reached for his coat. He wasn't going to wait for them to strike again. If someone wanted this truth buried, they were going to have to fight him for it. The cold air bit at Marchand's skin as he stepped out onto the rain-slicked streets, his mind calculating his next move. Whoever had stolen the notebook was trying to erase the link between Penrose and Andrews, but they had made a crucial mistake. In their haste, they had only confirmed that Marchand had been on the right track. He still had his memory, still had the names he'd skimmed in the notebook before it was taken. He needed to act fast. He flagged down a cab and gave the driver an address, the Hotel Lafayette. If someone had been watching him, they were likely watching others too. And if Madame Lauron had known something, then she might be in danger. The ride was tense, the city passing in blurred streaks of lamplight. Marchand kept his eyes on the window, scanning for signs that he was being followed. Nothing obvious, but he knew better than to assume he was alone in this. As the car pulled up in front of the hotel, he spotted something that made his stomach twist. A small group of guests and staff had gathered near the entrance, murmuring to each other, their faces pale in the dim light. Something had happened. Marchand stepped out, his coat whipping in the wind as he approached. He pushed through the small crowd, flashing his badge at the doorman. "What's going on?" The man hesitated. "There was an incident." Marchand didn't wait for further explanation. He moved swiftly through the lobby, heading toward the hallway where Madame Lauron's suite was located. As he turned the corner, he saw it. The door to her suite was open, one of the locks broken, the wood splintered. A thin sliver of light spilled from inside. He stepped inside cautiously, his breath steady, his senses sharp. The room was in disarray, drawers pulled open, furniture overturned.
A struggle. And then he saw her. Madame Lauron lay sprawled near the window, her silk robe stained with blood, a small knife still clutched in her hand. Her chest rose and fell in weak, shallow breaths. She was alive, but barely. Marchand moved.
Quickly, kneeling beside her. "Madame," he said, his voice urgent. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy with pain. Her lips parted, and she struggled to speak. "They took him." Marchand's pulse quickened. "Who?" She tried again, her fingers tightening weakly around his wrist. "Andrews," she whispered. He's alive." The words sent a shock through him. Before he could press her further, footsteps sounded in the hallway, heavy, purposeful. Someone was coming. Whoever had done this wasn't finished. Marchand had only seconds to decide, fight, flee, or hide. And this time, he wasn't the only one with something to lose. Marchand moved fast. He pressed a hand against Madame Lauron's wound, staunching the bleeding as best he could. The footsteps in the hallway grew louder, more deliberate. Whoever was coming wasn't in a hurry. They knew they had the upper hand. His eyes swept the room. There was no way to fight in these tight quarters, not without endangering her further. He had seconds to act. Madame Lauron's lips trembled as she tried to speak again. He leaned in. "They took him," she rasped. A shadow passed. Under the door. Marchand acted on instinct, dragging a nearby chair toward the door just as the handle turned. A second later, there was a sharp shove from the other side. The chair held for a brief moment before the wood cracked. He pulled Madame Lauron behind the overturned couch, just as the door burst open. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim hallway light. The man moved carefully, gun in hand, scanning the wrecked room. Marchand held his breath. He knew how this game worked. His enemy was listening, waiting for the smallest sign of movement. A creak in the floorboards, a breath too loud. Then, from outside, a sharp voice. "Hey, what's going on in there?" The intruder froze. Another
voice. A second too late. "Security's coming!" The man cursed under his breath and backed away. The door slammed shut, and then silence. Marchand exhaled, counted to 3, then rose to his feet.
He helped Madame Lauron up carefully, noting her shallow breathing. She had lost a lot of blood. There was no time to chase down the attacker. Getting her to a doctor was more important. As he lifted her, something on the floor caught his eye. 8 seats, single playing card. The ace of spades. It was pristine, placed deliberately near the window where she had collapsed. He frowned. He had seen this before, not in this case, but years ago, another investigation, another victim. A banker found dead in his study, a single ace of spades left on his desk. That case had never been solved. His mind reeled. The playing card had always been dismissed as a flourish, a criminal's calling card. But now it was here, a pattern, and if this was part of something bigger, then the real danger hadn't passed. It had only just begun. Marchand wasted no time. He carried Madame Lauron out of the suite, keeping his movement steady despite the weight of urgency pressing against his ribs. The hotel staff had gathered in the hallway, their whispers hushed and frantic. He barked for someone to call a doctor, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. A bellboy scrambled toward the telephone. She was losing blood fast. If she died, so would her secrets. As he waited for help to arrive, his gaze fell once more on the playing card in his palm, the
Ace of Spades, the symbol of death, of finality.
It had haunted him before, a puzzle piece that never quite fit. Now it was here again. This wasn't just a murder to cover up the past. It was a message, a pattern woven through time, each crime a thread leading back to something larger. Andrew's Madame. Lauron had barely managed to say his name before collapsing. They had taken him, but why? If they wanted him dead, why not kill him outright? Unless his disappearance 15 years ago had been staged for a reason. Unless he was more valuable.
Alive than dead. Marchand's pulse quickened.
This was never about one murder. Not Penrose's, not Madame Lauron's attempted assassination. This was about control. The doctor arrived, a wiry man with steady hands who worked quickly, pressing bandages to Madame Lauron's wound. Her breathing steadied, though her eyelids fluttered weakly. She wouldn't be able to answer questions for hours, maybe longer. But Marchand already had his next move. He stepped out of the hotel, the cold night wrapping around him like a vice. He needed to retrace the past, go back to where it started. The missing man at the heart of it all, Andrews, was the key, and there was only one person left who might know why Andrews had to disappear in the first place. Marchand hailed a cab and gave the driver an address, a place he hadn't visited in years, the prison, where a dying man still held the truth. The prison loomed ahead, a monolithic structure of stone and iron, its presence as cold and unyielding as the secrets it held. Marchand stepped from the cab, straightening his coat against the wind. He had been here before, years ago, but the weight of this visit pressed heavier on his shoulders. Inside these walls sat a man whose crimes had shaped this entire case, crimes that had never truly ended. The guards recognized him, wordlessly leading him down a dim corridor that smelled of damp stone and regret. At the end of the hall, behind rusted bars, sat François Delacroix, once a financier of high esteem, now a frail shadow of his former self. His thinning hair clung to his scalp, his hands trembled, but his eyes, those sharp, calculating eyes, remained as piercing as ever. Marchand didn't waste time. He stepped close to the bars, his voice low, but edged with steel. They took Andrews. Delacroix gave a raspy chuckle. Took him? My dear Inspector, he was never truly free. Marchand's fingers curled into fists. He had expected cryptic half-truths, but not this. Where is he? Delacroix sighed, shifting in his seat. You're asking the wrong question. You should be asking why. Marchand had been patient long enough. He pulled the ace of spades from his pocket and held it up. You left this at your last crime scene 15 years ago, and now it's back.
Tell me what it means. Delacroix's expression flickered, just for a moment, but Marchand caught it. Fear. That card isn't a signature, Inspector, it's a sentence. When the ace appears, it means the game is over. His voice dropped to a whisper.
Andrews was never meant to leave, Marchand's mind reeled. Penrose's murder, the Black Suitcase, the vanishing evidence, everything had led back to this moment. And then it hit him. The motive had never been greed or revenge. It was fear. Fear that Andrews, a man who had disappeared 15 years ago, had returned to reveal the truth. Someone had been waiting for that day, prepared to erase him before he could speak. But they hadn't killed him yet. Because Andrews wasn't just a loose end, he was the final witness. Marchand turned sharply on his heel, ignoring Delacroix's thin, rattling laughter behind him. There was no time to waste. The trap was already set. Now, all he had to do was spring it. Marchand moved swiftly through the prison corridors, his mind racing. He had solved the case, or so it seemed. Delacroix's words had all but confirmed it. Andrews was the key. The man had disappeared 15 years ago, only to resurface now, triggering a cascade of desperate crimes designed to silence him. The ace of spades was a death sentence, but Marchand had arrived just in time. If Andrews was still alive, there was still a chance to stop whoever was behind this. The moment Marchand stepped outside, the cold night air felt sharper, carrying the weight of something unfinished. He hailed a cab, giving the driver an address, not to the station, but to the abandoned warehouse on the docks where he suspected Andrews was being held. The clues had all pointed there. The black suitcase containing documents Andrews was meant to retrieve, the testimony of Madame Lauron before she collapsed, and now Delacroix's cryptic warning. If he was right, Andrews was alive but running out of time. As the cab sped through the empty streets, Marchand's fingers tightened around the playing card in his pocket. The ace of spades had returned after 15 years, and yet something gnawed at him. The symbol was too deliberate, too theatrical. It had been left as a warning, yes, but by whom? If Delacroix was behind this, why give anything away? And if someone else was pulling the strings, who was the real mastermind? The cab screeched to a halt near the docks. Marchand stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. The warehouse loomed ahead, its rusted metal siding reflecting the dim glow of the streetlights. No signs of life. But that was a lie. Marchand knew better than to trust the quiet. He moved cautiously, pressing himself against the building's exterior before inching toward a window. Inside he could make out movement, shadows shifting, a figure pacing. And then a voice, muffled but clear enough. Marchand's blood ran cold. It wasn't a voice he expected. It was Superintendent Renard. Marchand stepped back, heart hammering. Renard, his superior, the man who had scoffed at his suspicions, who had pushed to close the case early, who had dismissed the importance of Andrews' reappearance. He had been there at the start 15 years ago, and now Renard hadn't been covering up for Delacroix. Renard had been orchestrating everything. Marchand reached for his revolver, inhaling slowly to steady himself. If Renard was here, then Andrews was inside. But there was no telling what state he was in, or how far Renard would go to ensure his silence. Slipping through the side entrance, Marchand moved with measured steps, the scent of rust and damp wood filling his lungs. He followed the faint murmur of voices until he reached an open doorway. And there he saw it. Andrews bound to a chair, his face bruised but alert, and Renard standing over him, pistol in hand. Renard turned at the sound of Marchand's approach, his expression flickering between surprise and something else. Calculation. "So," Renard murmured, "you're quicker than I gave you credit for." Marchand kept his gun steady. "Put it down." Renard exhaled, almost amused. "You don't understand, Marchand. Andrews was never meant to return. If he talks, everything falls apart. Not just for me, for people far beyond this city. You think Delacroix was the mastermind? He was just.
Another pawn. The real game has always been bigger. Marchand's grip tightened. And you've been playing it for 15 years. Renard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're a good detective, Marchand. But there's one thing you don't realize. He moved before Marchand could react. Quick, precise, a trained motion. Not to fire, to drop the gun. It clattered to the ground, Renard raising his hands in mock surrender. Because he knew, even if he
was caught, even if this moment sealed his fate, the real mastermind was still out there. And Marchand had only uncovered the beginning. Marchand kept his gun trained on Renard, but the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The truth was out. Renard had orchestrated the crimes, concealed the past, and manipulated every piece of the investigation. But, as Marchand stared at the man before him, he couldn't shake the feeling that Renard was still in control, despite his empty hands, despite the exposed secrets. Behind him, Andrews shifted, wincing against the restraints. His eyes, swollen and bloodshot, flicked toward Marchand in silent urgency. They both knew time was running out. "I should have seen it earlier," Marchand said, keeping his voice even. "The way you pushed to close the case, how you dismissed the suitcase, the way you treated Delacroix's involvement as if it was the whole story instead of just a piece of it." He took a step closer, forcing Renard toward the wall. "The ace of spades wasn't Delacroix's calling card, it was yours." Renard's lips twitched into something resembling a smirk. "Quite the revelation." "You were the one who marked the loose ends for elimination," Marchand continued. 15 years ago, you buried the truth about Andrews and the people who wanted him dead. And now, when he came back, you made sure the past stayed buried until I started digging in the wrong places. And yet, Renard said calmly, you still don't see the whole picture. Marchand's grip on his revolver tightened. He had been a step behind for too long, not now, not when it mattered most. I see enough. I doubt that. Renard exhaled through his nose, tilting his head slightly. Do you really think I'd be here alone? The words barely left his mouth before Marchand heard the sound, a shift of movement behind him, too smooth, too deliberate to be a mistake. He pivoted just in time. A figure emerged from the shadows, swift and silent. A glint of metal caught the dim light. A knife. Marchand reacted on instinct, ducking the first swipe, his free hand striking out to catch the attacker's wrist. The guillotine blade twisted downward, barely missing his side as he shoved back hard, sending the figure stumbling into the light. It was Dufresne. Marchand barely had time to register the betrayal before Renard moved, not toward a weapon, toward the exit. Marchand's focus split for a fraction of a second, long enough for Renard to dart through the side door. A choice had to be made. Marchand twisted Dufresne's arm, forcing him to drop the knife before delivering a sharp blow to his jaw. The man collapsed, groaning. Then Marchand ran. Renard had seconds of a head start, but that was all he needed. Marchand burst through the exit, scanning the dimly lit docks. Footsteps pounded against the wooden planks ahead. A motor rumbled to life, a boat moored at the edge of the pier. Renard was escaping. Marchand sprinted forward, his breath sharp in his throat. He raised his revolver, sighting down the barrel. The boat rocked as Renard leapt onto it, hands gripping the wheel. If Marchand hesitated now, Renard would be gone. His finger tightened on the trigger. A shot rang out, not his. Renard jerked as the bullet struck his shoulder, his body twisting from the impact. He lost his footing, crashing against the side of the boat, the gun in his own hand, tumbling into the water below. Marchand's head snapped to the source of the shot.
Andrews, weak, barely standing, but holding a revolver with both hands, his arms shaking from the effort. Renard slumped against the boat's railing, his breath ragged. He turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "You really don't understand, do you, Marchand?"
His voice was thin, laced with something almost like amusement. "You think this ends with me?" Marchand lowered his weapon, stepping onto the boat as the motor sputtered. He grabbed Renard's arm, hauling him back from the edge. "It ends with whoever is left standing." The boat rocked as the police arrived, the pounding of boots against the dock echoing in the night. Renard's expression finally shifted, not to fear, not to anger, but to quiet resignation. It was over, or so it seemed. As Renard was dragged away, Marchand turned to Andrews, who let out a long, shaky breath before dropping the revolver. His hands trembled as he met Marchand's gaze. "You were right about everything," he muttered. But Renard wasn't lying, Marchand exhaled, glancing toward the dark water where Renard's gun had disappeared. The ace of spades.
A symbol that had haunted this case, a symbol that meant the game wasn't over. Not yet. Marchand stood on the docks watching as Renard was loaded into the waiting police car. The night air was thick with salt and the lingering scent of gunpowder.
Officers moved around him, voices crackling over radios, the sound of boots against the damp wooden planks filling the silence Renard had left behind. It was over, or at least it should have been, and yet something gnawed at the edges of Marchand's thoughts. A sliver of doubt, sharp as a splinter, buried deep enough that it refused to be ignored. He turned, his gaze drifting to Andrews, who sat slumped against a crate, head bowed, breath still unsteady. The man had survived, barely. But survival wasn't the same as safety. Not in this city, not in this game. "You all right?" Marchand asked. Andrews exhaled through his nose, a weak attempt at a laugh. "I'm alive," Marchand nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Renard's last words echoed in his head. "You think this ends with me?" It wasn't just a final taunt. Renard wasn't the type to waste breath on empty words. And if that was the case, then the answer was simple. It didn't end here. Marchand's fingers curled slightly at his side. He replayed the case in his mind, every step, every revelation. Renard
had been the mastermind, the orchestrator of this tangled mess.
But there had been things that never quite fit, like the missing gun. Renard's weapon had gone overboard, sinking into the dark waters below. But when the officers searched him, they found another, one he hadn't used, fully loaded, untouched. So why carry it? Why not use it? Marchand turned slightly, scanning the crime scene with fresh eyes, the docks, the boat, the bodies left in the wake of this case. His instincts told him something was still out of place. And then he saw it, a playing card, half-soaked, stuck between the slats of the dock, the ace of spades. Marchand moved before he even realized it, stepping toward it, crouching down. He plucked the card from its resting place, flipping it between his fingers. He'd seen Renard leave cards before. A calling card, a message, a game played in shadows. But this one, it was different. Renard was already in custody. He hadn't had time to drop this one, which meant someone else had. The hair on the back of Marchand's neck rose. A quiet understanding settled in his gut, cold and heavy. Renard had been right. there was someone else, and they were still watching. Marchand let out a slow breath, slipping the card into his pocket. The officers wouldn't notice its absence, and he wasn't ready to share this piece of the puzzle. Not yet. He turned back to Andrews, who was now watching him with wary eyes. "What is it?" Andrews asked. Marchand forced a smirk, shaking his
head. "Just thinking." He wouldn't say it out loud, but he knew the truth now. A case never truly ended. It just led to the next one.